Hello everyone, and welcome back to Ben Plays Games. There are many things the Half-Life series is known for: Gordon Freeman, Black Mesa, the G-Man, and more recently, as a cutting-edge VR experience. But there's definitely an argument to be made that it should be acknowledged for its horror elements as well. It's something that wasn't a particular focus for Valve in 1998's Half-Life, although it did feature its fair share of tense moments. But over time, it's become a more prevalent part of the series as a whole. Indeed, I've heard some people argue recently that Half-Life Alyx should be considered in its own way to be a horror title. Unfortunately, I don't own a VR setup and so can't attest to that myself, but in light of that argument emerging recently, what I think is worth examining in much more detail is perhaps the series' most famous foray into horror, Half-Life 2's chapter, We Don't Go To Ravenholm. It's such a special level not just because of its darker themes, but also because of how brilliantly it integrates a tutorial into its first half, and today, I want to take a closer look at both. If you enjoy the video, do consider subscribing to the channel, and now, let's start off by taking a look at the game's sudden shift in tone. In terms of letting players know what they're in for as they begin to explore Ravenholm, the transition from day to night tells them everything they need to know. Up to that point, Half-Life 2's levels had taken place during the day, and most of the areas players explored were bathed in sunlight, with only the occasional dark corners on offer. Because of this, the sharp tonal shift from mostly light to permanently dark, from sci-fi action to the macabre, is felt all the more acutely by the player when they eventually enter Ravenholm. The feeling of oppression already present throughout the campaign remains, but even that takes on a new form. Prior to entering Ravenholm, Half-Life 2 was oppressive by virtue of its story, one of humanity's desperate attempts to throw off the shackles of Combine oppression, whereas in Ravenholm, oppression comes from the sights, the sounds, and the atmosphere. Oppression by the Combine is a problem that could seemingly be vanquished by the end of the game. Gordon Freeman, and by extension the player, are essentially battling against it. But Ravenholm's oppression is one that cannot be fought against. The player is merely trying to escape it. And that idea of contrast extends into the chapter's opening few minutes. Prior to escaping to the doomed former mining town, players are engaged in a game of catch with Dog to begin learning the ins and outs of the gravity gun. It was an entertaining, somewhat relaxed introduction to the weapon, letting players get a feel for what it could do in a more light-hearted setting. Ravenholm continues to act as a tutorial immediately after, but, in terms of look and feel, it's the complete opposite. Players make their way past a dead body, head crab shells and legs hanging from a tree, before the game continues to subtly teach them. Opposite the entrance to the chapter's first room is a zombie cut in half by a saw blade, and there's plenty more blades and explosive canisters in the immediate vicinity. It's an obvious pointer as to what the player is supposed to be doing, and it may not seem that clever, but you have to remember that at the time, Half-Life 2's physics system was a mechanic that hadn't really been seen before, and as such, the idea of interacting with objects in the environment in the way it asked the player to would not have been as blindingly obvious as it seems when examined today. At the time, it was groundbreaking. As the player picks up a blade to begin experimenting, a pair of zombies immediately appear to harass them. Players should understand at this point that the game is carrying on from where it left off after the scene with Dog, and feel a sense of familiarity because of it, but at the same time also begin to feel a distinct sense of unease due to the incredibly different circumstances in which the second half of this learning experience is taking place. They're no longer learning awesome new tricks from robot dogs in a setting devoid of pressure, but instead being forced to quickly adapt while under intense pressure in a nightmarish setting. And after progressing through those opening few moments, Half-Life 2 continues to encourage experimentation for some time. Up until the player is handed a shotgun by Father Grigori at around the chapter's halfway point, there are very few ammo pickups. Ravenholm's first half does everything it can to ensure the gravity gun is used as frequently as possible, and severely limiting resources is a very clever way of doing just that. For a time, the player is able to get into a rhythm, moving through areas packed full of objects which can be interacted with, not just in terms of the gravity gun, but in terms of traps as well. The traps don't directly teach the player anything new about the gravity gun, but they do a great job of continuing to further the idea that you should be taking down as many foes as possible without firing your weapons. They don't teach you more about the gun, but instead work alongside it, helping put the player in that weapons-free mindset. And they enhance the feeling of kineticism to encounters in Ravenholm as well. Half-Life 2's gravity gun is so satisfying because of the constant feeling of movement it imbues items with, and the way blades spin, cars fall and fires burn when traps are activated does much to further that effect. Even the shotgun is introduced as part of a mini tutorial of sorts. Rather than just leave it lying around for the player to find, it's handed to them in very specific circumstances. As it's thrown across to them by Father Grigori, faster zombies begin to swarm the rooftop players are stood on, pushing them in the direction of using it in close quarters. Most players will already understand that the shotgun is most effective at close range, but nonetheless, the way the encounter is set up ensures that's the case for every single person playing the game, whether they're totally new to shooters or not. The game even gives the player audio cues to point them in the direction of when exactly it should be used, with drain pipes making a distinct sound as the zombies climb up them. And the zombies themselves even become easier targets while attempting to reach the player, giving them the chance to score a few easy kills straight after acquiring the weapon. These design choices and the way they help anchor the player to the world through subtle opportunities to learn and interaction with in-world objects are fantastic. But of course, it would still feel like there was a missing link if the enemies themselves weren't equally impactful, and this is where Ravenholm's horror elements begin to come much more into focus. If the dark, dreary town is unsettling, then the zombies themselves are downright horrifying, and for the duration of the chapter, they're the only enemies the player encounters. The run-of-the-mill zombies, encountered most frequently, are a fantastic setup from those featured in the original Half-Life. Imbued with a lopsided, shambling quality, they're extremely well done, and while not especially dangerous to the player by themselves, they do still feel like a threat when they appear in larger groups. They even sound terrifying, and if you play their groans backwards, it becomes even worse. You can quite clearly hear the side of them that still retains some humanity, crying out for help. Excellent sound design is equally important when it comes to the other types of zombies players meet during the level as well. Before you ever see them, you hear them. It's often said that horror is at its best when much is left to the imagination of the audience, and in that regard, Half-Life 2 does a terrific job. Both the fast zombies and the poison zombies can be heard long before they're seen. Those paying attention can catch glimpses of deceased fast zombies as well, even if they won't necessarily understand at that point what they're actually looking at. It's a similar situation with Father Grigori too, who I'll touch on in more detail shortly. Before you make his acquaintance, you hear him. And Valve ensures that the creatures you encounter, and Grigori, are all you hear during the majority of the chapter. Using only diegetic audio, sounds heard in-world by Gordon and thus the player, does so much to further the horror atmosphere. The only music you do hear is at the very beginning and the very end of the chapter, with the track in question acting as a bookend to the horror you witness in between. At around the halfway stage, the chapter begins to ramp things up significantly, and it's at this point, confident in the player's newfound ability to use objects in the world to their advantage, that Half-Life 2 begins to raise the stakes. As mentioned, the first half of Ravenholm is very much about using the gravity gun against regular zombies and headcrabs, but during the back end of the chapter, the game begins to again introduce ammo pickups more regularly to the player. And along with that, they're finally properly introduced to the new enemies which had only been hinted at so far. Headcrabs and zombies have been a threat, but by this point they've lost a good deal of their ability to frighten. They've become familiar. So when black headcrabs, which emit a terrifying scream of their own, poison zombies and fast zombies appear on the scene, the player is suddenly thrown into turmoil. Not only do they represent a host of terrifying new threats for players to deal with, but they necessitate a switch in tactics as well, and that makes their introduction a change of pace and of atmosphere that's felt just as acutely as the transition which takes place when first entering Ravenholm. Suddenly, zombies present a real and genuine challenge. The headcrabs and zombies encountered up until this point can cause problems, but it's unlikely, which means tactics weren't altogether necessary. Players could stand their ground and fight, safe in the knowledge that if they were overwhelmed, the damage penalty wouldn't be too severe. But now, the player has to switch things up. Poison zombies, and the black headcrabs they're covered in, require far less aggressive tactics. It's in players' interests to back off, so as not to be brought down, albeit temporarily, to a single point of health. Fast zombies, in my opinion at least, require the opposite. They're too quick to run away from, and staying where you are runs the risk of being surrounded, or distracted while other threats approach, so the best thing to do is move towards them and remove them from an encounter as quickly as possible. What this combination of fast, regular, and poison zombies creates is a wonderful mix between short, mid, and long-range tactics. The player has to learn which is appropriate to use at what time, in order to make it out of confrontations unscathed. It can be a real assault on the senses at times, as players desperately try to take out incoming zombies without being cornered, all the while trying to keep their distance from the blackhead crabs thrown by poison zombies. And then, just as they think they've escaped, fast zombies come bounding at them from across the rooftops. If Ravenholm itself has by this point also become somewhat familiar, the darkened streets becoming less threatening over time, then the introduction of the new zombies does much to ensure the town remains just as terrifying as it did when players first entered it. The constantly changing pace of combat, depending on the mix of zombies encountered, means the level continues to feel fresh even as it nears its climax, but also as dangerous as ever. Fortunately, players do have some support in the form of Father Gregory, the priest you heard briefly earlier, and he's a fantastic character. As there are no Combine present in Ravenholm, Gregory is the only human you'll meet, and he's about as perfect a horror character as you could ask for, fitting in brilliantly with the tone of the chapter. He's a man teetering on the edge of insanity, having witnessed the town's fall, which adds to the horror atmosphere, but also makes things feel more human in a way. He's a man who's clearly been deeply affected by what's happened. Gregory refers to zombies as his flock, and he their shepherd, and that idea of him being a shepherd works well in the context of the chapter itself, as he very much shepherds Freeman through the level. Even the idea of him being a father works well in its most literal sense as well. He gives advice and supports the player in the way a father would their son. He even acts as a mirror for players increasing confidence in their own ability as the level progresses. Gregory likewise becomes more confident in the player too. He's the human connection in an environment that otherwise seems positively inhuman, but he's never lucid enough that he offers any real and lasting respite. Eventually, players team up with Gregory for Ravenholm's final stretch, and it's here Valve brings everything together for one of Half-Life 2's most memorable segments. By this point, the transition from gravity gun tutorial back to first-person shooter, now with added gravity gun, is complete, and the finale begins with players being forced to take down zombies using more traditional means. From there, it opens up, both in terms of setting and options available to the player as the pair enter a graveyard, teeming with zombies. Here, at the chapter's end, Half-Life 2 does its best to remind players that from this point on, there's a world of combat options available to them. Guns can be used, barrels can be shot, and objects can be fired using the gravity gun. The game doesn't explicitly tell you which tactic to use, and instead lets players find their own feet, essentially preparing them for the coming chapters. Is it subtle? Not particularly, especially given the zombies in a cemetery cliché, but I'm not entirely sure it was ever meant to be that way. Instead, this is the game handing back power to the player after forcing them through such oppressive surroundings for so long, for keeping them on the back foot. The majority of enemies here are regular zombies, and there's a million ways to take them down, which means by the time players reach the chapter's conclusion and leave Gregory for good, they feel empowered, emboldened to take on everything else Half-Life 2 has to offer. Even after playing through Ravenholm several times to make this video, it's a level I'd still be happy to go back and revisit. The way it teaches players new mechanics in an environment which encourages experimentation is quite unlike anything else, and when combined with its oppressive horror atmosphere, it becomes a truly unique gaming experience. It's an area I truly believe every gamer should endeavour to play at one point or another. Graphically, it may not be at quite the same level as horror titles released in the present, but I'm not sure that really matters when everything that underpins it is quite so fantastic. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider subscribing to the channel. I've got lots more coming up, and hopefully I'll see you again soon.